Good morning. I call the special meeting of the South Burlington School Board to order on Saturday, May 17th, 2025 at 10:01 a.m. Any announcements or announcements to the agenda? We'll move to comments from the public. Are there any comments from the public? Would you come sit next to Bridget to make a public comment? That way hopefully the owl.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Chelsea. I don't know if it's just in this.
I'll speak now.
Yeah.
My name's Mark Gable, community member. Thank you. That's all. Straight up, thank you guys for spending.
Nice comment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody online? I'm not seeing any raised hands online. So we will move right on to agenda item 4, panel discussion with former school board members. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. We've decided to convene with these former board members this morning to learn from their experience and ask them some questions and hopefully learn a lot of valuable things to know about effectively working as a board and serving our district. So thank you all so much for your time. I was thinking that to stick to the agenda, I can ask each question, and then if you want to just answer, I'm sure looking at the agenda, you have different questions, you have more points or maybe less, and so just whatever you'd like to share. And then before we move on to to the next question, I'll give board members or the superintendent an opportunity to ask follow-up questions based on what you share. Yes.
And then are we gonna do introductions too? And then also like, yeah, do we get to ask you guys stuff? Cause I'm curious too. No hard questions.
Yeah, would you all like to briefly introduce yourselves? Or I can
Yeah,
introduce
can you hear me okay, or need to?
Yeah, you're
Yeah, first I wanted to say, I'm really happy, Chelsea and Violet, you're allowing us to meet here. There were several people who wanted to come. You may still see today on Bugby who will show up later. Julie Beatty was interested in coming, and Patrick Ledoux was also interested. But I think it really is a reflection on, you have a lot of folks in the community who have shared the experience you're having now, and several of you are relatively new and onboarding. And there's a lot of empathy for the school board role and a lot of sympathy for the school board role. I would also say that each of us have shared a lot of different experiences, and to the extent that our lived experiences can support through both your onboarding and the circumstances you may find yourself in today and in the future, we're happy to serve in that capacity. And I think, yeah, this is more like a table of survivors more than anything. So if I can start with introductions, I'm Elizabeth Fitzgerald. I served on the school board for 15 years, served in the chair capacity for about half that time. You know, introductory words are why I even got introduced or was interested in running in the first place was I kind of came on with an agenda around financial management, and I was looking at budgets that I was being asked to approve as a community member and seeing a lot of surpluses and not really understanding why those didn't get embedded into reducing the tax rate versus getting rolled over into more spending. And so I came on with a little bit of a, chip on my shoulder around financial management. And what I learned really quickly is, and I subsequently counseled many board members that were interested in running and that ran successfully, is don't come on with an agenda. And it largely is, you're here to do the work of the board, and you're here to represent the community. And nobody joins the school board without valuing our public education system and educators either. And there are circumstances where it feels like you're challenged in that capacity, both valuing education, the cost of education, as well as those employees within the district. And you need to, we all have had to learn to live with some of that tension over the years. But anyway, I loved my service. I loved all of the people I worked with. We all don't agree on things, and I think we found really positive ways to work together and move the district forward in our various capacities. So thanks for having me.
Can I just ask a quick question? Thank you. Did you all serve on the school board at the same time at any given point?
We did overlap.
We're only missing Alex, yeah, otherwise the band is back together.
We overlap, but we all serve with different people. as
True,
well.
well,
Yeah.
So I'm Merton Malone, and I served on the school board for 11 years. I think it started around 2009 to 2010. I can't quite remember exactly when I got on board. At the time, Rich Cassidy was the chair. And I got on the board because there were a group of parents, 4 of us were meeting to get out the vote for the budget. Yet another difficult budget, I think, way back when, but it did pass. And we learned that Ted Manazar was not going to be running again. And I drew the short straw and was put up to run. So that's how I ended up on the school board. Although at the time I was very interested in the negotiations and the impasse that was about to be reached with the union, the teachers union. And that was kind of an interest. I don't think it was just that wasn't my only agenda, I don't think, but that was a hot topic at the time and continued to be a hot topic for all the years that it was on the board, so.
All right, Bill. Brian Menier, I had the shortest tenure of anybody here. I only lasted 3 years, so sorry. And thanks to all of you for what you're doing and stepping up at a time that was also not too easy. I have 2 kids who went through the district. One is now a sophomore in the high school, one is a sophomore at UVM. And I really liked our schools, and they came up through Orchard, and that was a wonderful experience. And when they got old enough, I finally said, okay, I got a little bit of time, I want to do something. And in this town, if you raise your hand, someone will find you. And I didn't care what it was. And so Martin found me and lied to me and said it was going to be 2 meetings a month. It's going to be about 3 hours. You do a little homework, not a problem. And that was true for a couple of months, maybe over that first summer. And then we got into the master planning and visioning and trying to build a new middle school, high school. And I think that attempt at the bond, along with COVID, along with, there was a racial incident that probably everybody here knows about, but still can't really talk about. I think those 3 really colored my tenure. But it was that failed bond effort that really hung over everything, and then COVID just sort of exacerbated it. I think either one of the bond effort or COVID would have had me leave after 3 years. But I was just fried by the end of it, and so stepped down, having not achieved much of what I wanted to do. But the failed bond effort influenced what I wanted to do going forward. And so when the opportunity appeared to go work in the legislature, I thought I would go in and fix school construction in a couple of years. Yeah, well, I'm no longer on education. They kicked me out. And so I passed the baton to Bridget, who was going to fix it in the next 2 years.
So just so you know, I've been working on that for 8 years.
Yeah.
I just want to manage your experience.
So it's your fault again, yeah, all right. And then more later, yes.
I think we have Elizabeth to fix everything at the city level. right?
Yeah.
Covered on all fronts.
That's all from you.
I'm Bridget Burkhart, you know everybody, I also was lied to by Martin. And Elizabeth,
Nice.
and Elizabeth, no, I got involved, in the school district, I have 2 kids, one is now a sophomore, with Brian Cedric, my Wells is a sophomore, and I have a 6th grader. We were just starting to focus on the schools more heavily. We focused on them enough to move to South Burlington for the schools, but the kids were very little. And Wells was actually at Renaissance School at the time, and he was looking to transition into Rick Marcotte. We knew that was gonna happen. At the same time, some of you will remember the whole push to consolidate all the elementary schools, based on the idea that our enrollment was declining and we just need all these 3 schools, and they really wanted the Rick Marcotte property for city center for lots of different reasons. And I got nudged by a fellow community member to start going to school board meetings to learn more about it. And then I started asking a lot of questions. And as Brian said, if you raise your hand and you ask a lot of questions, someone will find you. And Elizabeth found me. Dan Fleming, who was on the board at the time, who was an engineer and was focused a lot on numbers and a lot on budgets and on construction, was stepping off of the school board. And so thought that maybe I would be a fit. So I served 3 2-year terms on the school board. I had always thought I was a stay-at-home mom at the time that I ran, and I had always thought I was gonna go back to my career in finance. And I delayed that a little bit extra because of COVID, so I stayed on a little longer than I probably even would have, because of COVID. And although I guess I had already made the decision, so really, I was starting to think toward work, but I thought I would do one last term and then transition out, which is what I ended up doing. And worked for a few years in finance again. And then that job was winding down since it's a fund that was not raising another fund. And Martin had already talked to me at one point about thinking about the legislature. And so Noah Hyman decided not to run for this, I sit in now in the legislature, so I decided last year to run, even though I saw Brian at state band competition the day after they adjourned, and he had been on floor until 3 o'clock in the morning. I still signed up to run for legislature. Yeah, and so my main issue when I came on the board, I wouldn't say it was an agenda, but it was the issue that sort of got me going to school board meetings regularly was master planning and visioning, and really thinking about what we needed in terms of facilities over the long term. And I spent a lot of my time working on that. But yeah, once I got on the board, was very quickly sort of ensconced in all the different issues. I guess that's it.
All right, with that, shall we move on to our first question or any follow-up questions or comments?
I just want to say, I find it interesting that several of you got on because of one issue or one interest. And then suddenly the door opens and it's a whole different story once you're on, so.
I think most of us though knew, I mean, we all had like an interest that drew us to really get more involved, but I think all of us ran knowing that board service meant looking at all the different issues, that you can't be a one issue person on a board, especially, you guys now have 7, but even with 7, you can't really be a one issue person. There aren't enough people to have one person be the person on a specific issue. And with 5, we definitely couldn't. There just wasn't the bandwidth for anybody to sort of be a single issue person.
There we go. And I was naive enough to think that I was gonna get on and mostly talk about pedagogy and how things are going. And it's, here's your first fire, here's your second fire, and so maybe someday y'all will get there, but kind of doubt it.
Yeah, and we can go with the agenda, Chelsea, but I encourage anybody if you want to deviate from this, it's really meant to be interactive, so. Go for it.
Start with those questions. I thought they were great.
Right, so the first question is, when and why did the district decide to move to a policy governance system? And the follow-up questions under that are dealing with policy governance and potential contentious issues which fall outside of the monitor and report calendar. And what challenges did you have with monitoring reports?
Yeah, why don't I start with that, because I think it started in my tenure and kind of went on from there. There was, I can't remember the year, but there was a community strategic planning session that really focused on defining what the values were from the community with public education. And that is really where the ANS policy came from. And at the same time, policy governance was being evaluated in school systems across the US, but in Vermont as well. And there were other districts that had adopted it before South Burlington did. I believe Burlington, maybe not Mansfield did, I can't remember, but the intent of it was to really keep the board out of the weeds. And it was to differentiate where boards really define policy that administrators and staff would execute. And I have always struggled with the negative language around it, and I think we all did, where what you're really defining is what the superintendent as CEO of the district is not allowed to do to accomplish your ends policy. And what the challenge with that, there's a lot of pluses to defining where the board stays and where superintendent staff stay. The challenge is in a couple things from my perspective. One, the monitoring reports are scheduled on a calendar basis, so if you start to have feedback bubbling up from the community, the first challenge is the board really needs to define the feedback that's coming in terms of a policy. So it may be treatment of community or treatment of staff. And so that would be the conversation the board would have at that level. And then if the monitoring report is 10 months out, a decision really has to get made around, do you accelerate that monitoring report, or do you say we'll have a modified discussion? And I always described the way we use policy governance as modified policy governance, and you'll hear other districts say we'll use the framework of policy governance because it still keeps you out of the weeds. But that is probably one of the conflict areas or areas of tension that I noted, which is policy governance isn't intended to lock a board in, but it is intended to frame conversation at a higher level, not at an operational level. Where the superintendent or staff are really implementing policy. So that was the sort of start of policy governance, and it was also focused on the community's input around the values of education. I have to say, I am not aware of another conversation that happened since then, which probably was in the 2000, before 2010, certainly around master planning, there was, but another conversation that didn't sort of tap into, is this what the community still values in terms of what public education is delivering? So I'll stop there because I know we all have some experiences and opinions about it.
Yeah, so when I started, the policy governance had only been in place for a very short time. And all the policies, monitoring reports and such were in place, but there wasn't an ends policy yet. We hadn't defined what ends we wanted. And we, so early on in my first term, that was a focus of the board, was coming up with the ends policy, which we did, and then struggled to figure out how to monitor how we were doing on the ends. And that's probably an ongoing consideration, and I'm sure that's evolving. And at one point, we revisited the ends, probably in my third term, and got more public input on those ends. And then we continued to try to figure out how to best monitor and how we were doing on the ends. Meanwhile, as we were looking at monitoring reports on all the various other issues. I'm a little out of touch over the last few years where that ends policy monitoring is. I think we were getting there, and our ability to monitor the ends was better. Although it was still difficult to connect how well we were doing on the 4 categories of ends, which shockingly, I can't remember off the top of my head. And how that connected to the various monitoring reports. That was another challenge that I felt was there. So, but I agree with Elizabeth as well. Another challenge was, in fact, as issues came up, trying to fit those really into the policies was important to give a structure as a board and how we were governing the district. So,
Yeah. I don't know that I have a whole lot to add. I was really grateful for policy governance. I came on, these folks are on the board. There was a great deal of expertise already there. I had this framework that they could help me walk through, having done it themselves. And so I had this crutch or assistance or whatever, that basically none of y'all had. I mean, I know you have policy governance, but I had somebody to say, here's how you do it, and here's what it means. Yeah, I know you can read the paper, but that's not the same as having these folks say, here's what it really means. It is useful, it is a crutch, it is something to help guide you, but it does sometimes feel like a straitjacket. And I don't know if you felt like that. I think it could be perceived as a shield by the public, like you don't want to answer a question, that you're stonewalling. And so it's tricky. And so I was grateful for this notion of modified policy governance, in particular, as it related to the racial incident that I mentioned earlier. We went through an examination of the incident. It was dealt with correctly according to policy, and the outcome satisfied exactly no one. And that was and the board, the public. And so another investigation was done. And in this sort of modified policy governance world, we said, well, yeah, you know, this, that, and the other happened as they're supposed to. But the outcome, it's not acceptable, and so we're gonna deal with it slightly differently. And I think that got to a better place with the public, but it really did make the relationship with the superintendent a struggle, because it's like, I have a contract, I did my job, I hit my marks. And so I think you need to figure out what sort of relationship you want to have with a superintendent and where the problems are with the public, and let that guide you into what kind of policy governance you want. Because it seems to me it's useful for like doing your homework and then having a guide. But I think there is a perception that it's not going correctly. And I don't know if that's your perception or if that's just the public's perception, but I do believe that's out there. There.
One comment with that is, within policy governance, anytime the board wanted to modify it, the question came up of who's gonna do the work, because if you're taking away something from delegating it to the superintendent and staff, it means you're taking it on as board. And that is something to think long and hard about, because there may be a capacity issue, there may be a skill set issue, that, you know, there may be a funding issue to bring on consultants and support that effort. So that's always another point of tension within, if you want to maintain or have more control over something, it's gonna be taking it away from your CEO.
I won't talk too long about it because I think everyone's covered a lot of it. I will just own that when I came on the board, it did feel, there was a tension for me. I've been on boards before and understood the role of a board versus the role of operations. But then you're an elected official as well. And so you feel like you have all of these bosses in the community sort of watching what you're doing and asking you to represent them. And the first meeting I had with our former superintendent was basically, it felt like to me, he was putting up a wall. Like, it was like, here's policy governance, go study it. You stay out of my business, basically, you know, like we have this, that, or the other touch point. The rest of this is my stuff. You stay out of it. And it wasn't framed exactly that way, but that's how it landed. And it was training, and I was still trying to understand policy governance specifically, because I'd been on boards that weren't so formal about like what structure they were using. But they were more like corporate type things. And so people understood what their roles were. You know, the board wasn't even in the building most of the time. They were off in different states or different places before they would get into a room once a quarter or whatever it was with the CEO. And there were very specific reports that were happening all the time, and everyone was just used to that structure. It's a little trickier here. So I can think of the two main places we modified policy governance. I can think of while I was on the board were master planning and visioning. And that had already kind of been modified before I came on the board. And it wasn't that the board completely took it on, but that even before I came on the board, it was more of a team effort, if you will, with the superintendent, because it was such a big ask of the community that we were probably gonna have to make in terms of bonding. And because we were talking about changing the whole structure of where kids went to school, it really felt like a conversation that the board needed to be part of in a different way. And then I will say a different racial issue, the changing of the rebel name, because the board had delegated to the superintendent. That was within the superintendent's power. In fact, if you read back through our old policy, technically, he had the responsibilities of the principal of the high school. He had that in his purview. He wanted to. He could have just made a blanket statement at some point, we're changing the name and that's it. But obviously there was a lot of community feeling about that. And before I came on the board, the superintendent had been instructed to try to rebrand the revenue. That had been the whole community discussion. That's where the board had landed. And then it just, for various reasons, has not happened. And the board really, I would say at the behest of one of our student members, kind of pointing to the students who are normally here, really said, he held our feet to the fire as a board and said, you promised this was gonna happen. It's not happening, so something needs to change. And that's when the board, I wouldn't say that we just did it, but we did give firmer direction, let's just say, to the superintendent that this now has to be changed and we have to do a process. And we did really leave that process for the most part up to the superintendent structure, but we did give a pretty clear directive that like the maintenance teachers to figure out how to best make that happen. So there will be some times probably where you need to modify, and you think very carefully about when you decide to modify. Because I've watched other school boards around us who don't necessarily adhere to policy governance. And as a board, it can feel okay to feel like you're not adhering to policy governance, but you have to think about future boards that might be sitting in your place. And I have watched some other surrounding boards where people who have very different views on what should be taught in classrooms, like what curriculum should be used, whether there should be a student just opinion, whether there should be the Black Lives Matter flag, whether there should be all kinds of different things done within the schools. And if you don't have a very clear policy governance structure, and folks like that manage to end up on the board, it can completely change the face of a school district overnight in a way that maybe the community doesn't love, because a lot of folks, to be fair, are a little checked out of school board election until something like that happens. And I think policy governance is kind of a framework that protects the district from any of those kind of, switches back and forth just because of which members are sitting in the chairs that you're sitting in right now. But it is, I will own that it is a learning process, and it feels completely uncomfortable to have that tension that, hey, I was elected to represent the people who are really wound up about some specific issues with my role as a board member, in policy governance, and that was really close stuff.
That was an exclamation.
Yeah. I'll take that as a sign to stop talking. At the moment, and if you guys have questions, we can reach that way. Oh, no.
I had a couple of questions for Seamus. I think you have a question.
So I have three questions, but I'm only gonna ask two right now. So when you say, like, I remember in the executive limitations, there's like, shall not change the name of the school. Was that something you guys added?
Oh, yeah, 2.7, asset protection. Won't modify the name of the school.
If we did, it was very early on. I think that was always.
So I guess the real question is like, when you guys say that you modified the policy governance, was it ever reverted or it's still kind of, when you say
When
modify?
we say modified policy governance, it basically means there was no sort of place, I don't think, that we ever wrote down, like, here's how we're modifying policy governance. It was more, I remember Martin was also always very clear when he would start to make a statement about something. I have a very strong memory, especially about master planning and visioning when I first came to the board, but he's saying, this goes outside of the bounds of policy governance, but here's why I think it's okay for us to be going out of the bounds of policy governance on this specific issue or at this specific moment. We never, that I can recall, ever said, you would know better because you're steeped more in the current policies. And I don't think there's any policy that says, this is how we're modifying policy governance.
I don't either, and I think I don't see a violation of 2.7 asset protection because you can change the mascot, but not the name of the school. And it talks about altering image, and, that was a contentious issue, and some folks in the community did feel that was detrimental to the image. Others felt, really strongly in the opposite direction, and I have to say from a, superintendent's perspective, to have board support in leading something like master planning and visioning, like we don't have the staff to do that alone, and to have board directive to, board directive on something like, rebel name change. I think that support, must have been really great for the superintendent at the time. I mean, I can't imagine going that low in this position.
Next, just a follow-up question that Seamus was asking, because you say modified policy governance, and do you mean like you're actually gonna go in and change the wording of the policy, or is it, this is an instance where we need to usurp some of the
I think
responsibility?
it's really process.
It's,
Yeah.
okay, there's like a really important issue here, so the board is gonna step outside of its bounds. Normally it would not do this, but in this instance, it's going to.
Well, and with recognition that, that should be very deliberate and strategic. when a board decides that, and generally speaking, I would say it's also situational. So there's a finite start and end to the board
To the
engagement,
modification.
that modification, as it were. And it tends to be with the projects Bridget mentioned, kind of bigger issues that come up and sensitivity to the community too. I know, I'll speak to the Rebel name. That was a situation where I had to change my mind on that, and some of it was evidence-based, and the initial impression was, this is Vermont, for goodness sake. It's like, what's the big deal? We're not aligned with the South and betters, you know. And then all of a sudden, evidence started being presented of yearbooks that had, you know, Confederate flag in them, and Dixie was sung at games, and you look back 50 years and it was, oh gosh, there really is some foundation there that was certainly, you know, not ill-intentioned by any means, but a history there that recognized the current times and sensitivity. And at the end of the day, it's about the students. And, you know, I know today, the folks who graduated from South Burlington prior to the mascot name change still refer to themselves as Rebels, and that's their right and their purview. And there's a lot of pride with that. And students that were engaged in the name change in a very thoughtful way led by administration are very proud of that as well. So, but it was a very contentious issue within the community.
Yeah, so just to get back to what Tim was asking or saying, like, right, there's no rule, it's fuzzy, but, you know, is there a community outcry? Does it feel like this is a big issue? Are things going in a way that you don't like? Then you probably need to have at least a conversation between the board chair and the superintendent to say, we might need to step out of our lane a bit, sorry, you know?
That's like some, for me, anytime something like that has happened since I've been on the board, and I've served on a board that has almost the entire time been completely new. So it feels like we're not a deep bench of people who have a really strong foundational understanding of like, what is a new board member feeling public pressure for the first time, and what is like legitimate public pressure. And so I feel like my philosophy along the way is very similar to parenting, where it's like, if we bend the boundary now, why can't we bend the boundary later? And so I've sort of really held to like, what are our policies? And this is what we have to stick to, because we'll be setting precedents for future boards if we can just bend the rules when we want. And whatever issue this is, maybe it means that we need to rewrite the policy or consider the policy differently so that the board has more latitude to, but it's so like all these issues that we're talking about that like, you don't put those policy, you don't put, like, they're too granular, but they are a community outcry of a problem. So this is really interesting perspective, because I think, at least for me, this whole time, I've just been like, can we come back to policy? If it's not in the policy, we're not doing it. And I've held like really strong to that, to my own downfall. I've gotten a lot of criticism for that, and it's okay. I can handle it, but it's just interesting to hear that perspective from you all. And like, what's your retort to that
And
idea?
I think what you're saying about being so new, sorry, I see your shape.
Can I,
Yeah, okay,
answer, in addition to that question, I mean, you know, I keep coming back to, I don't know how to cite this, I'm not a lawyer, you know, section 563.2. A school board may take any action that is required for the sound administration of the school district. And so that would kind of be in it's like, well, policy governance is something we choose, but we couldn't take any action. So I'd love to hear some comments on the interaction between those.
Yes, I mean, but maybe these three disagree with me, but to your point, you don't want to modify it all the time. You want it to be super rare. It has to be one of the really interesting instances. And I think what you said about people being so new, I mean, I'm thinking about when Bridget and I stepped down, there was entire board turnover, there was superintendent turnover, there was finance turnover, there was special ed turnover. I believe there was director of education and you were decapitated.
That was my first day, and I popped up Sam's on the.
Yeah.
So that's what.
And on the seventh day, all right, and so in that context, at least for a while, I think it makes sense to be reliant on, and maybe even overly reliant on policy governance, but maybe there's time to revisit, to have a retreat as people get, you know, and say like, do we want to take a little more liberty with this? But I think what you're doing makes sense.
It's hilarious that you said you think there was executive director of learning turnover, because that was me.
I don't know if, it was helpful for me, to make the trip over to Montpelier a couple of different times to do VSBA training with folks from other districts. Because they just have different issues. And it was just helpful to sort of have on the table different issues and how to react to them within the framework of policy governance, because the VSBA has been very strong, you know, advocates for implementing policy governance, and I find them a great resource. And then I lost my second, but yeah, that was the main one, was really, going and training alongside of other people was really helpful for me, just to get out of the South Burlington context for a moment and see what people are doing at a different level.
Yeah, and I think the other tension, and I know this board and other previous boards have struggled with this, is that, the public comment side of it, with really understanding, are you starting to see an issue bubble up to the level? And it can't be the, you know, noisiest or the loudest voice in the room. It probably will happen over time versus, you know, a point in time. But, you know, one thing I know I would encourage is really, I know, you know, it's easy to sort of say, this is, your meetings are a meeting of the board in public. But I have, my own experience has found that if you give a lot of opportunity for people to voice what's going on, then it helps you understand what's a trend and what may bubble up and what's sort of a situational complaint or issue. And your meetings may take longer in the beginning, but it does build and establish trust with the community as well, where you can respond to those issues. You know, I think that's a fine balance, but to me, that was always worth the investment of time.
So I just would make one other comment about the executive limitations, the policy. So we did along the way modify those policies, given we would see what monitoring reports were providing, but that was a very deliberate process as well. And we thought very hard when we were looking at, and I'm not gonna remember which ones, but it was usually really more tweaks than anything else. So don't be afraid to, if something's not working in one of the monitoring reports, one of those policies, it can be changed. There's a process for it.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think while we have you here, you know, I want to get to the elephants in the room. And one of them for me is that policy governance is kind of like an executive order. The next administration, I don't think, is bound by it. And so like, when a set of board members comes in and they're given this straitjacket of policy governance, you know, I think that in the background, kind of unstated, is that if the majority of the board on its first meeting said, we want to get rid of policy governance, they could. And so like, you know, and so like, on my first day, I feel like what I wish I had heard was, policy governance is a choice that we made. It's a good idea in the same way that like separation of powers is a good idea. Like you don't want the executive, you know, messing with the courts. And so, and when you cross those lines, and so like, it just feels like policy governance, part of the weakness it has on the board, not talking about the community so much, is that the board is like, on the one hand, we know in our hearts that if we didn't want this, we could get rid of it. But on the other hand, we're being told that like, we have to be really strictly following it. And so, it would be good to like emphasize the parallels to our own system of government. And I go back again, I'd love to hear, you know, Martin, I know you're a lawyer, you know, like, may take any action that is required for the sound administration of the school district. If I'm like a board member who's feeling very empowered, you know, and I'm like, oh, sound administration of the school district, I'm gonna, you know, tell the superintendent that we are not gonna fire that person. Like isn't that truly where the line is? It's not policy governance that's the line. We can cross that line, like we've been saying, anytime we want. The line is really something like section 2 or something.
I'm not sure how to answer that one.
Well, I mean, you oversee the superintendent, but you don't get into the operational stuff. I mean, and I think you can certainly at any time have a conversation about how you want to run yourselves, remembering that you're always overseeing, but you're not doing the superintendent's job, you know? And if you want to see something different in the future, you feel, you know, the super's not doing it right or something, that's when the contract comes up. And that's the other thing I'd be really careful about. If you are trying to get away from policy governance or alter it greatly, make sure you look at the contract first, because
Yeah,
I think there are metrics to be hit.
I'm not suggesting that I want to get rid of policy
Yeah, yeah.
governments, I'm just saying that like, it feels improperly defended to me. It feels like it has not received the defense that it deserves, and I think that you could make arguments like, for example, separation of powers, you could say, well, board, listen, even if you go beyond policy governance, you know, the section 563 still restricts you from doing operational things for these reasons, like, that would be something that's like more real than just this kind of phantom, like, well, don't break policy governance.
So I would simplify how I looked at it, is that we are not experts in education whatsoever, and we shouldn't be managing education. And that's what policy governance provides, is a structure so that you're not micromanaging, but you're holding the CEO accountable. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the ends policy. Again, I mentioned it a little bit before, because that was probably my biggest frustration in the whole policy governance realm for the 11 years that I was there, was establishing those ends and then figuring out the metrics for those ends. And the third item, being able to tie that to all the other executive limitations. And I don't think we got there in the 11 years that I was there. It was improving. And I think that's the critical part, is to be able to look at how are we doing? And that all should be with how we're doing with the kids and where they're going. And so that's a part that I also feel often would get lost with all the fires that we had to put out along the way. And it was hard to really focus on continuing to try to get the ends metrics right, and have them involved. But backing up again, I think that's not micromanaging, it's taking what the community wants for the district, the outcomes. And then figuring out how to monitor how that's going. And then connecting it to how we're overseeing, you know, the operation without micromanaging. That's complicated, but that's kind of how I look at it.
And I think I look at it as, if you recognize that you have that authority as a board member, you know, what is the alternative? If you eliminate it, you know, do you want to come up with some alternative of governance? And I would say the policy governance and the strategic planning in the community was probably a 4 to 5 year process. And so it's a long runway to do that. You know, specific example that you brought up, obviously that's a personnel issue. There's nothing preventing a board from better understanding the CEO's decision-making process in those things in executive session. And that, you know, building that relationship of trust, and I would say all of us have situations where we didn't understand certain things, and we either individually went and sought that information out, we either collectively did it in executive session, or it was brought up at a public session. And good examples would be a monitoring report. There'd be something presented around a monitoring report that looked at some data, and I remember many times one of us saying, yeah, that just doesn't measure what we're looking for. And, you know, and what requested the superintendent go back, and we might brainstorm some other ideas of data that might be more demonstrative of a monitoring report. Oftentimes it wasn't available yet. I'm assuming there's more data available now, but really fine tuning the monitoring reports to really become a tool that the community could look at and say, okay, when I look at academic proficiency as one of the ends, here's how the district is measuring it, and I agree with that, or that falls a little bit short of the mark, so how do we improve that over time?
So I just want to say that was like my next question, was about the content of the monitoring reports themselves. And again, executive limitations is about what you shall not do, right? So it's sort of this backwards look, you know, you want to see what you are doing, but you're actually looking at, here's what I'm doing that's, I'm not supposed to, like, you know what I'm saying, I guess. But I guess my question is as you work through the monitoring reports, and this was one of my first struggles and continues to be a struggle, is you really get no training in what you're looking at in a monitoring report, or what should I be looking for? There's a lot of information. So when you work with Dave Young over time, it sounds like you went back and said, well, we kind of need this, or we can kind of explain it to us this way or that way, and sort of that was an ongoing process. I guess my question is too, when you looked at a monitoring report, it was scheduled for a certain board meeting you were gonna look at, and I assume you got the report ahead of time. When you got to those points personally where you were looking at it and you're like, I just don't quite get it, right? I can't connect the dots. At that board meeting, did you say, let's push this out? I don't quite understand, or we have to vote on it tonight? Or how did you do that logistically? If you didn't feel you had enough information to consider it?
I think typically if we got to a board meeting, well, first of all, I think a lot of us availed ourselves of the opportunity to send an email to say, hey, David, this isn't resonating with me, or I feel like I'm gonna need more information, just so you're not surprised in the board meeting, I'm gonna bring this up. It's just a polite thing to do, so that you're not surprising your superintendent in the board meeting. And then, yeah, in the board meeting, we would say, this doesn't really hit the mark, like, this isn't showing me, you know. The one that for some reason stuck in my head is like the cameras, like there was like this whole policy about like cameras and how we could use them and how many incidents, you know, the South Burlington Police used our cameras to investigate and that kind of thing. And I do remember us like sort of coming and saying, this doesn't feel to us like this monitoring report is explaining why you made the decision or how, you know, which incidents were allowed to be shared with the police and all this stuff. So there were situations where we come to a board meeting and say the monitoring report doesn't really hit the mark in terms of what the monitoring report is asking for, or we can't really decide if you're doing a good job basically on this particular policy. And then that would get pushed to the next board meeting and David would come back with more information about that. Sometimes if we got the report far enough in advance, he might be prepared to come with, you know, additional stuff at the board meeting. All of that needed to be done in public so the public could see how we were monitoring the report. But all of the sort of like not surprising him and then asking for more information can be done ahead of time. Same for Violet, I'm sure. Yeah, and that jogged my memory. My second point previously, so it was on the training thing, was I found it really helpful, and I don't know how much Chelsea, you and Violet have done professional development together, but David and I did more than the required hours. Like there were some required hours, I don't remember whether it was policy or law or whatever, that we had to do some professional development together. And it was really helpful because being in that situation helped us each understand how the other person kind of approached things, and it just sort of put us on the same page on a lot more things, or at least helped me understand how I needed to ask a question to get what I needed from him, or how I needed to help give direction.
Could I ask a follow-up on that?
Yes.
I feel like the superintendent and I have an excellent working relationship
Yeah.
and we communicate very well. And sometimes I'm trying to advocate on behalf of board members that have questions and I don't always feel like I'm effective at interpreting their question in the way that, so like, I actually feel like the need is for board members to potentially have a better working communicative relationship with the superintendent to get their questions answered. And I don't know if I'm doing a poor job I'm trying not to overwhelm the superintendent with all the questions at once. So ideally, it would be like, send all of your questions to me and I'll organize them and then I'll ask Superintendent Nichols and then report back. And often I also want those questions to be asked in public session. So sometimes it's like, I'm gonna forward your question to the superintendent and we'll address it in a meeting. But that's felt like a struggle sometimes, is to effectively ask the questions on behalf of other board members. And
See, I never saw it as a board chair. I was only board chair for a year, so maybe I wasn't doing it right. But I never really saw myself as like the gatekeeper or the organizer of other board members' questions. That's where it really came down to me to feel like we were all elected separately to be representatives of the community. And so I felt like sometimes you could do a little smoothing over if there were some rough edges on things, but like mostly it was to just make sure there was space board meeting to make sure that questions were asked that board members had, and that there was space to get those questions answered, even if it meant holding over an agenda item for a second meeting to make sure that questions were answered. I never wanted to feel like I was speaking on behalf of other board members or trying to navigate that in any way, even if it was challenging for David. It was that's part of his job, right? Was interacting with all of the board members and they all got elected for different reasons. And so I felt like I needed to let them have their own clear voices. And I was not afraid to use my own as well. And often we were on the same page and I would ask a lot of the same questions that other people had, but I didn't feel like I needed to be a gatekeeper. And maybe you and Violet have a different arrangement, but yeah, David and I were pretty clear that that was not my role.
And I think before, if I'm remembering right, and Elizabeth can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I had questions, I would copy the chair, when I was, asking the question of the superintendent.
I just think currently we have a culture of board members can directly ask the superintendent, particularly if they know it's not my wheelhouse, if it's operations. I'm wondering if you could take a stab at like how many different requests and questions you think board members would send each week to the superintendent.
15 to 30 per day.
Hello.
Right.
I say that's too much.
Yeah, that is too much. Yeah.
No, I would wait for something big. I never chaired. I served under both Bridget and Elizabeth. I never felt that either one was a filter or a funnel. I would flag them or copy them somehow when I was writing to the super, just because I wanted them to know. But no, it would have to be pretty big. It's not gonna be a minor point. It's gonna be, I think the data's wrong, or there's really a big problem where we need to do this sooner than you think we do. So not even once a week, I think. Yeah.
I was on the high end because I nagged a lot about numbers, specifically about, especially around budget time, so. I know David got sick of hearing from me because he told me, no, in a very nice way. Yeah, no, actually, in all seriousness, David was actually very patient with me. Even before I was chair, I was writing him. Not every day, but more than once a week probably, and the main thing for him, he was happy to take all of those emails. He didn't necessarily get to all of them because he had a pile of things to get to. The main thing was not for reaching out to his staff without him being okay with that. And so I would never, ever, ever reach out to a teacher or one of the principals or anybody like that without his say so. Or not his say so, but his sort of just, yes, that's okay with me, or here's the conversation I've already had with that person, just so you know. And he was very open about sort of facilitating that if I felt like I needed to talk to Pat about something, for example. I will say that, he did give me a little bit more of a direct, you can just copy me on your emails to, the Director of Finance and Operations, because a lot of my questions were about finance and about the budget. And I do feel like the budget really does sit squarely with the board in terms of having to get comfortable with it and, you know, represent the community in that regard. So most of my questions were about, budget and negotiations numbers. Numbers that, you know, we needed when we were at the negotiating table, and a lot of times those sit with, you know, the Director of Finance and Operations. And so David he got to the point where he was comfortable enough with me not overstepping terribly, and like asking for report after report after report. He got to the point where he was comfortable with me just emailing Gary Marcus at the time and, you know, just copying him on that. But you have to build that trust, right? That you're not gonna just ask for this bit of data today and that bit of data tomorrow and that bit of data the next day. That there needs to be that kind of understanding that Director of Finance and Operations has a whole lot of other things to do. And yes, negotiations are important, and yes, the budget is important, but you have to be just respectful of people's time. And so, yeah.
Should we move to the ends policies? Because I'd love to. I think we've heard a little bit about how they were developed, but also there's the question about, you know, why they didn't change. And how do you change them? So let's hear about that.
I had a question about what did you folks mean by the words leadership or trades?
Yeah, Seamus can talk on that. Just for the record, I'll read the question out. So how were ends policies developed? Why did you not add the ends policies, i.e. the words? The question is, why did you not add the words leadership or trades to the ends policies? And how does the board change the ends?
And I can clarify that. I think that, you know, it could be, why didn't we add the words car to that? You know, I don't think the actual words matter in particular. I think it's more like, if you look at the ends policy, it says last changed in 2014. And also like, was that because you felt that it was difficult, or you felt that it was not important? Or that other things came up, or like, just why did they not change?
Yeah, my recollection is, first off, that it was the community who decided on the 4 areas through a pretty long process. And the ends itself, really, I remember a lot of discussion on being broad enough to allow for our students, when they walk across the stage, to be going to whatever their next step is, because it needed to encompass those folks who might be going into military service, into vocations, into, not necessarily a college-oriented outcome. So I do remember that being very deliberate, and that was intended to be as inclusive as we knew at the time. The process to change it, I would say, if there was an interest in changing any of the 4 categories, I would definitely include the community in on those discussions. And then the typical process would be sort of a warning and 3 hearings before anything would be changed. So it's a pretty standard lead up to any policy change, but if you're looking at the high level, it was intended to be as inclusive as it could be, and then the 4 specific areas were really directed by the community after quite a bit of discussion.
And I would say, in my tenure on the board, I don't remember the community giving us pushback on the ends. I mean, people seem to be happy with how the ends were operating and seemed comfortable that they were broad enough, as you said, to sort of be a guide for what we were doing. I just don't remember there being a lot of energy behind a change to the ends policy.
Now, the metrics, I remember some pushback, where's the data, we don't trust your
Yeah.
data, we don't believe your data, but.
Are we
think that-
doing the ends? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was part of the issue as well, of not changing the ends because we hadn't quite figured out how to fully monitor the metrics. I mean, that was the focus, is trying to understand how we were doing on the ends that the community had wanted.
And I believe that was in the superintendent's contract as a goal, like multiple years in a row, that we will have a clear, we will have a clear ends policy monitoring system that tells us clearly whether we're meeting the ends or not.
So I remember in a discussion in an earlier board meeting, we were talking about, making a change to the executive limitations, even if it's like a word or 2. And the superintendent brought up that, that's all, interrelated set of concepts. And so if you unbalance it here a little bit, push it here, you have to kind of take into account how that might impact all of the other executive limitations. And so that's like a considerable change that has to be considered, carefully, maybe with lawyers. And so does that also apply to ends? Like, my understanding is that executive limitations and ends are somewhat orthogonal. Like you change one thing, you want one thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to act in any different way to get to it. So would you say that changing ends is easier than changing executive limitations? Is changing executive limitations harder? Like reflections on any of that would be.
It depends. I mean, if the ends are being changed in a manner that we don't have the teachers or whoever to, the administrators to achieve that goal. If we want an ends, that would be experts in AI. I mean, are we able to accomplish that with the resources we have? So I mean, that would be the consideration. You may want to do that, but that would be the consideration. So it could be a big change for the ends, or it might not, just really depends.
Is there a particular end, part of the ends that's like not working at the moment, or that's come up as a problem?
I think there's, I have an interest that I think that the ends policy, and this is just me, it's not, and I'll advocate for it, but it's not like I'm not representing a board or something when I say this, that like, I think that, right next to the word college should be the word trades.
Yeah, sure. Could make sense. Put it off the community, as a community member, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, there are lots of different paths. I mean, they talk about that a little bit, but sure, that's totally valid.
It's not like, they're not excluded by language currently, but naming them is an, I think, a nice gesture. So I think that's as Elizabeth was saying, it's written currently to be as inclusive as possible. But I think there's an argument that if you're gonna list, college or university, that listing trades would elevate that profession to the same level of.
Yeah, I think it was always contemplated that what the MSAC
Yes.
want to achieve, so.
And I would say that that would probably be a non-controversial change,
Yeah.
that specific change. The challenges you're gonna have, as Elizabeth said, the method to change the ends is to open that policy up, you know, and that is where you're potentially gonna run into a bigger challenge. If you open it up to try to put that one non-controversial word in, it's a community process of having to have the hearing and like, you know, have it heard a number of times. Are there other things that are gonna come up? Are we then litigating like the entire end policy to try to get that word to it? And I don't have the temperature of the community on how they feel about the end policy right now. So you would have a better.
Do you think that should chill our speech?
No, I don't
No.
think it should chill our speech, but my point is just that, you know, how strongly do you feel about having that specific word? If the trades are already contemplated under that big broad category, how strongly do you feel about that? And maybe the community right now is perfectly happy with the ends for the most part, and I would say that I have only ever heard expression from the community of more emphasis on trades and vocations and things that are not necessarily college pathways after high school. So I don't think that specific, like I said, I don't think that specific thing would be controversial. In fact, you'd be celebrated for it. The question is just whether there's anything else in the ends that people are worried about.
Right. And so it's kind of balancing with like, you know, we wanna get political points for the board so that we can do things like propose spending more money on things like new facilities. And so maybe something like that would get us some political points because we're emphasizing that. But on the other hand, like you're saying, there's this balancing of, well, does that open up the opportunity for there to be a big fight about adding equity stuff to the ends that maybe wouldn't be supported by the feds, but would be supported by the community? Sure, okay, I see.
I think also it's just the environment that you're in, that is being emphasized at the state level. We all know that you can't get a tradesperson when you want one, you know? And so we're trying to incentivize that sort of development, and there is a focus on career and technical education. So I think partly that's just gonna happen. But yeah, it's the same question, you know, what's the phrase that everybody's using recently? Is the juice worth the squeeze?
Oh my God, if I have to hear that one.
Is the juice worth the squeeze? That's the new corporate lingo, yeah.
It's tired corporate lingo, this is the tax department's lingo, they say this all the time, when we want to
Sure.
change policy related to taxes.
Yeah, talking about that, yeah.
And, yeah, and I would also just caution you a little bit about scoring political points for the board, because, I found as a board member, maybe your experience is different. There's always half of the community that's mad at you about something and half that's super excited about what you're doing. And sometimes those two have switched depending on what the issue is. And so I never felt like I was gaining political capital for the board that was then spendable on other things, because it was sort of like the people who cared about this one particular issue were paying attention when that issue was being talked about. And they were not supporting me or like helping me in other areas when I needed, you know, potentially help on other areas. So I would just be focused on really the ends, you know, like what we're doing for the kids. And you're gonna have tricky political waters as a board, just because that's the role of school boards right now.
Yeah, I think capital comes from competence and communication. That's it.
Yeah, one thing I'd add, because we just sort of talked about this, is part of establishing that trust with the community. And we talked about sending questions in and getting things answered ahead of time. I do think the community wants to see the board deliberate in public. I mean, that is part of a transparent open meeting law, and it's not necessarily to argue, but there's many meetings where I think we all and former board members went in knowing it was highly likely we're gonna agree on a topic, but we often, one of us or somebody else would sort of bring up, okay, let's play devil's advocate here. Who are the people, who are the stakeholders that might be impacted adversely by this decision? And let's consider that and at least acknowledge that as we move forward and take action. So I think that considerate, deliberate, you know, consideration of all the stakeholders that might be impacted by a policy decision also serves to establish trust as well.
Well, especially in this very thing that you're talking about, it seems like there's at least some mild disagreements on the board, so have a polite disagreement in public, you know? I think I would want to see that, yeah.
We had lots of polite disagreements.
And some impolite ones, yeah.
Yeah.
Some big
I think that's a very helpful piece of feedback, because I have, in my experience in the last 3 years, I have found often the whole team agrees on everything, and it is just real, like, we've not been good about playing devil's advocate or explaining why we agree. We've just sort of been like, well, yeah, okay, moving on, and like, in retrospect, that's not helpful to the.
And that can't look like a stitch up that happened in executive session, yeah.
Totally, yeah.
But again, I think a lot of it is due to the fact that we've had such high turnover.
Yeah.
Right, and you have people who are constantly in learning mode. When you have a board of 5 people.
Yeah.
And 2 are relatively new all of the time, you're simply just not going to have that in-depth discussion at all. Right, so I think that's been the challenge for the last several years.
There's not a lot of political nuance, at least for me, or I don't know what the right word is, but I have found that I'll do something and then I'll receive criticism and I'll reflect on that criticism and I'll say, oh, I should have done this, like maybe performative action, just so that the community understands. Like, I can give a very brief example of, as the chair, I could add something to the agenda outside of a meeting, right? Like, I'm the one who compiles the agenda. And sometimes it's a really good idea to add that agenda item in the meeting so that the community hears you add it to the meeting, or to the agenda, so that community members don't look at the agenda maybe at the last moment or something for the next meeting and go, oh, what's this? Like, this is an important topic to me. I didn't hear this added at the last meeting. That can seem very intentionally, deceptive. Sorry, I'm just got a dry throat. And like that, I think those are the kinds of awareness, or, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but just.
Political.
Is it political?
No, it's transparency, and I also would say, I would go another step further. I tend to overstudy in the background before I come to a board meeting. I do this right now in my role as a legislator as well. And I've been asked by people before to, like you said, that word performative, ask questions even if you don't have questions anymore. Sometimes, because sometimes people at the table or in the public might not even know the questions to ask if they have not like dug in. So I'm sure all of you each have your own like separate issues that you're most passionate about. And it can be really helpful if people get in the habit of asking questions, even if maybe they already, not all the time, they know the answers. Sometimes that's really annoying and you don't want to, I mean, so we don't do that on the floor, we're not
Word.
on the floor. But it can help in a meeting to draw other people out, and it will help them create other questions to ask too sometimes.
And I'll speak to my council onboarding, when I transition. Part of my own learning process is I ask a lot of questions. And it was intentional on my part because I got to learn more. So I was asking questions about like AP orders and things like that. And I know some of my colleagues were, oh God, Rufus got another question. And, the feedback is that you just have to get comfortable with is if you are thinking of questions, there's likely somebody in the community that has the same question. So ask it, and, it helps on 2 ends. And, one, it establishes trust that you get the information, it informs you, it probably informs somebody else that didn't think to ask the question. And, the other thing that you can do in board meetings is if there is some community feedback on an issue, there's nothing wrong with making a suggestion. Should we consider adding this to a future agenda? And not making it a big topic, but making it, we would like to be more informed about X, Y, Z, because you're hearing a little bit about it, whatever it might be.
I was just gonna speak to what you said, Chelsea, and ask folks about transparency, which I think has been something that the community has yearned for from the school board and administrators a lot. And so I think you pointed out a great idea of performative, but it's more like just because you could add it by yourself, it doesn't mean you should, or that you can't speak to it, because that, I think the more information, the more that some people don't care, but I think community appreciates that kind of thing that you were just talking about. And the board in general, doing things, even if we could do something that might be more in our realm, I think getting it out to the community as much as possible and taking that route is always the best way to go, to build more trust from the community.
Yeah, I think in teaching or acting, you talk about exposing the device, sort of showing how it works, and to some degree, your role is to do both of those things, you know? And to bring people along, to make them do it with you, kind of, show that it's not just, you know, lockstep certitude and we're done. Yeah,
And just like to that point, as in my experience as chair, I'm trying to demonstrate to fellow board members that I'm receptive and willing to take their suggestions. And so sometimes it's like, well, I need you to add this to the agenda now because I want it discussed at the next meeting, which means that I can't go back and say it at the previous meeting. And then also to your point about sharing information with the community, I have at times gotten feedback that like, we're pushing too much information and what we're sharing isn't helpful. And so there's always going to be feedback about like how you do everything and finding that political subtlety nuance of like striking a good balance is difficult, but worth it. Jeez.
Yeah, I wanna build on, I think. You know, what you were saying, you know, like, what's the right word for it? I think you also said like, what's the right word for it? And I think. We're not, and this is more for us, so not as much for you, but if you have any reflections on it, I think. It's like, we're not in the age of like. Walter Cronkite and Peter Jennings, and you know, like, there's not like a mainstream media that people trust. And there's also not a like trust in institutions and officialdom is just cratered. And so like, I think that people want to see their elected representatives out in front of them. Talking, performing. And that will be good for the district, and I think that we should not be afraid to call it what it is, which is, you know, gathering, you know, trying to build consent and support, and maybe like for budget votes, I think when I was talking about political points, I'm thinking about the swing voter, because I think that generally the parents will vote with us most of the time. It's that swing voter. I don't know how it's gonna work for bond votes, because you know, in 2019, it was, that was not swing voters, you know, the community. You know, and I don't know how you get over like a 1,500 to 6,000 with political points, like that doesn't sound sufficient. But we do have to, I think, acknowledge that we're in a new age after COVID, just people just got sick of hearing from Fauci, even if you might personally trust him. And so like, we have to be a little bit aware that us acting officially can come across really out of touch right now. That's my opinion.
well, I don't wanna usurp the chair because you're running the show, but I feel like we're basically getting into the communication.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
gonna. The great segue, great segue.
Yeah.
He did that intentionally.
Your sense, I think, is correct. I think everybody here feels it, that there's this sort of antipathy for expertise or for eggheads or whatever. And I think that makes it all the more important to show how you arrive at a decision as opposed to being imperious and saying, here, you know, here it is. But that gets back to how do you communicate with people? And I had a great deal of struggle with that. I actually got off socials during my first year on the school board because things got so, you know, lots of heat, very little light, I guess. Are you tired of that one too? No, it's okay. It's another good one.
Did a lot of people raise their eyebrows?
Yeah, oh. No, it's, but how do you push out information? Because you cannot respond to everything, and I think Bridget will probably be better able to speak to this, because you did try for a while to engage in that forum, and, well, maybe you can talk about your experience, but the volume is gonna be too great, but there has to be some way, and I think it is the communications person, Julia McGuire, is that right? That has been helpful, I think, pushing out more information. I wish it could be done on even a greater variety of subjects, and people aren't gonna be spoon-fed, they're not gonna accept it all, but at least, you know, here's why we're doing this, here's why we're doing this, and they can put it back in whatever forum they want to. But yeah, if you are doing anything on socials, make it very clear that I'm pushing out information, this is not a place to engage, please show up at the meeting. Or you're getting live, so I'll leave it there.
I did have a goal in my chair role at the time to respond to community emails like within 24 hours. And it was often received your email, you know, I'll, if you're okay with it, I'll bring it up at the next board meeting or something that acknowledge receipt. And I did find, you know, getting in too detailed in an email it took up too much of my time, but two, it could also sort of document something that hadn't been flushed out by the board. So it was not appropriate to make those commitments or even register an opinion because they hadn't been discussed by the board. And that's one of the challenges, I think, with communication is you want to foster those relationships with constituents and hear what they have to say. But you also have to recognize even nodding can imply agreement. And that can be problematic because you haven't acted as a body at that point. And, you know, you have that right to agree as a private citizen. But there's some caution in that too. I don't know if you folks could answer that, but just a thought.
Another thing, oh, sorry.
Well, and maybe this will, because one of the first things you brought up today was the idea that we're elected representatives and when we were talking about talking to the superintendent, you said many people felt that they were elected independently, you know, we're not elected together. And so, on that theme of like, well, what do we have to do versus what have other boards traditionally done? You know, I know that the board cannot act individual, you know, individuals can't evaluate staff, they can't instruct staff to do things. But it feels more in the realm of tradition that like a board member couldn't offer their opinion except as a private individual, you know, and so like and so I guess what I'm getting at, to go to what you were saying, Elizabeth, about you couldn't even nod, and I think that is, as elected representatives, you know, as a pseudo legislature, like it's in the law, like we're a pseudo legislature, like I think it's actually more okay to agree with things, even if, as long as we don't give the impression to a staff member that we're telling them, yes, this is what we're gonna do. So where is that line?
And I think it is a tricky line, but I think it is. We had a communications policy. I don't know what the communications policy is right now, especially around social media. I don't know if it was an official policy, it was a guideline. We had a social media policy.
We've all,
guideline.
nothing's changed, all the same.
Policy stuff, yeah. It is almost impossible for the community to hold in their heads that you're speaking as a private citizen when you are a board member. And so I pulled way back from any kind of social media engagement that had any kind of opinion, any kind of steer about how I was going to vote on something, or what I really, anything that had to do with an opinion, because I realized that when I was out there on the socials, even if I said I'm not speaking for the board, because you're a board member, the community assumes that you are. And even if you put the disclaimer out front, it's really hard not to look like you're speaking for the whole board, and you don't, because you don't represent the whole board when you're out there on the socials. And the only thing I was doing a lot of social media engagement because we had some really big projects, and that social media engagement was meant to provide facts. So there's a lot of misinformation that circulates in the community about what the board has agreed to or not agreed to. And most of all, there was a lot of misinformation when I was on the board about what was in the budget or not in the budget, because people weren't following it line by line by line as we were going through the budget. And so I would jump on to say, hey, I'm not gonna engage in a big debate. I just want you to know, this is this data point that is not quite correct. Have at it, keep yelling at each other if you want on social media, but just so you have the facts. Or I would go on to just point folks directly to district resources and let the district resources that were up there sort of speak for themselves without a whole lot of opinion about it, because it's just too hard for the public to try to hold those things in their heads that oh, this is Bridget as a mom or as a community member versus Bridget as a school board member. And I really don't think it's appropriate for the board to be out there one at a time. Yes.
Did you ever consider having a school board Instagram account where
We
you could
had a school board
push stuff?
Facebook. We're so old that
Okay.
Instagram wasn't much of a thing
much
yet. It was just coming up.
Okay.
So we had a school board Facebook page that I think that Mark and I were originally the administrators of, and then I think you were before you got off.
I got
social.
pushed onto it for a hot minute, yeah.
And then it got handed over to Alex McHenry when I went off the board, and it just kind of sat there not doing anything. And then I think it was decommissioned eventually because it's sort of dangerous to have it out there potentially hacked or whatever. So we did, but we used it very, very sparingly around very specific things. So for example, when we're in the master planning and visioning process, and there would be a new document that was created that all of us had agreed to, that, you know, the architects had prepared for the community or whatever, we would use it as a place that people could go to get stuff like that. And we did make very clear in board meetings, though, that our methods of communication as a board, because we did not have unlimited bandwidth and unlimited time as complete volunteers. Our methods of communication were really to come to board meetings, to call us on the phone, because our phone numbers are all up there, and to email us. And the Facebook thing was kind of an added bonus, but that was not gonna be a method that we were gonna push information out to the community. It was not gonna be a meeting warning system, like all of that stuff still stayed with the district. It was really just sort of a nice to have in terms of additional information, additional resource for folks. And we also said on Facebook, we are not going to reply to every comment on there. Because we just, like I said, you know, as volunteers without staff, there was no way to like keep up with what would happen on it.
But as I recall, and tell me if I'm wrong, like, a fact would be pushed out about some line of the budget or whatever, and within 5 minutes, it would come back, you know, that's a lie. And it's like, or are we doing any good stuff? You know?
Well, what I would do is I would make sure that that David and Gary Marcus would have online somewhere where people could find it, the actual data. And then I would say, here is the link to the actual data. If you still have questions, if they're, you know, if there are sort of operational questions, they need to go to David. If they're like, what the heck is the board doing, then come to a board meeting and ask us. And that was one thing I would say that was really, before I forget, because my brain is a little scattered today. There also is a balance between sticking to the policy of public comment only in specific, you know, timeframes. And there are moments to expand. And we, I think, tried to find that balance. I have failed at it. Elizabeth was great at it. Like I had a tendency to let board meetings go till like 11 o'clock at night, because especially around budget time, because people have such strong feelings about specific parts of the budget. And especially in this unfortunate era that we're in, where we're making cuts every year. It really, people need to be heard, you know, and even if you make a decision that's different than, you know, all the stuff that you're hearing in a meeting, like they need to feel that you're listening at least. And sometimes those restrictions about 2 or 3 minutes and only in a very specific framework about like, oh, you missed public comment at the beginning, so no more chance to talk about stuff. Or yeah, just sometimes the boundaries could be expanded a little bit, especially around budget time. And if there's a specific issue, like when we were hearing about the rebel name, there were meetings and meetings and meetings that Elizabeth sort of like let 50 people talk, even if they were saying the same thing or 2 different things, but you know, 25 each. Because people need to feel like you're listening to them. Yeah.
I think there's a big difference between not listening and not acting on that testimony, right? So and I totally agree with that
Yeah.
point, that it's, we have an obligation to listen to everyone. We do not have an obligation to try to follow and act on everything we're hearing. That has been my least favorite part of chairing the school board, is figuring out when it's okay to bend the guidelines and when it isn't, because we harm community members when we say, okay, now you can talk, no, you can't, just kidding. It's my least favorite part. And in this role, it's often trying to read the room and also maintain a strong team with the board members who often have very different opinions on how it should be handled. So it's been.
Well, yeah, you need to make it clear, like, this will help to inform me, maybe it helps to inform my decision, but I remember things were pretty contentious one meeting, and I think it was Martin was told by someone, from the public that, you know, the town has spoken. I was like, there are a lot of voices out there. So settle down, thanks for the info, you know.
So, you know, if one of you spoke, like, or one of the legislators, spoke, nobody would assume that you're speaking for the legislature. And so I'm wondering, what guidelines did they give you as legislators in terms of your public presence?
I mean, I think it's, you know, it's quite different, you know, that, yeah, we do act as a body, but with 150 legislators, I don't think anybody thinks that you're speaking for the legislature. Even if it's on a bill that has passed, and this is your opinion of the bill that's passed into law. There's all sorts of precedent case law on how to interpret legislative intent. And essentially, whatever the words say in the law, that's what counts most. So it doesn't count what I say, frankly, even as chair of the committee, so. So but I don't think people perceive my monthly column as speaking for the legislature. And I think when I was on the school board, they would see me as speaking on behalf of the school board, whether I was or was not. So I was very cautious, just like Bridget as well. But there were times where we would identify one of the school board members as our spokesperson and gave some leeway. So for instance, in the strike, whenever that was, we met 17, 16.
It was
something like that.
2014, because right.
Was it really that long ago?
Or 15, it was right before I came on board.
That long ago, I was kind of the spokesperson because she ran and was out of town after a week. The first and only board meeting that I shared was during that week with the strike. We had 250 people at that board meeting. Thank you very much. Anyway, so there are instances, and I think Bridget was really the person for that, was the public spokesperson. So there's that flexibility as well.
I think there's also a parallel, Seamus, maybe not at the whole like legislature level, but at the committee level somewhat. And I think along the way, if I were talking to someone, I could say, I don't like this idea, but it seems like the committee is going that way. But then once you pass something out of committee and you're on the floor, like, we think this,
But not necessarily your political opponents would say, we support this, like the ranking member may not say, oh, I agree with what we passed out of committee.
I mean, well, so we're, in mine, corrections and institutions, we're split right down the middle. We've got 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, basically 1 independent leaning that way. So there are lots of different opinions, and the ranking member can and has said that he doesn't like the way that something is going while it's still in motion. But then the committee, votes it out, then that's what the committee has done, and you are the committee, yeah.
I do think I submit that for us in this political environment, we might want to not take for granted that the community cannot tell the difference between a single person and the board. And I think that, as we try to act more effectively, we might want to try to get more to that point where people know that, like, if I say something in the other paper, I'm not speaking for the board, and that may just unlock a lot more communication and engagement. That's in my opinion.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? This current board and its current structure has struggled to agree on board statements. I think we've issued one in this current arrangement. And as you know, open meeting law makes it very difficult to edit a statement without it turning into a meeting. And so the process is very clunky and takes a lot of time. My perception is that the community would not think that you're speaking on behalf of the entire legislature because you represent our community in the state realm, whereas board members, we represent our community at this realm. So I can kind of see that distinction being a problem, but I wonder if this board would engage more effectively with the community if instead of board statements in the other paper, we had board member columns in the other paper where it was like, I'm Seamus and this is my opinion, not the board's opinion. I think that your experience saying that you don't think the community tends to distinguish a board member from a board position, but also right now we're struggling to get board position statements out because we really don't agree on everything. And building consensus has been really challenging. So what's sort of the response to
From my
that?
standpoint, the real place to have that is in board meetings where your individual views and personalities come out, and people have a lot of venues to participate in that, even looking at tape meetings. As far as the statements go, I know in my tenure as chair, I think somebody would draft the statement. We'd send it out to the board members, ask that reply only to the chair, or through the superintendent. And it often had a time stamp on it, like within 24 hours. And then I know I would often send out So speak now or forever hold your peace. This is the statement that's going out on behalf of the board. So that allowed for some of the time issues that came up. And people either really felt strongly about it or I'm okay with that type of thing. But I do think, you know, one thing, you have a lot of talent on the board, different strengths, and figuring out where to leverage people's strengths on the board, whether it's in a spokesperson capacity, whether it's in a writing capacity, whether it's a financial capacity, I think that's gonna be really important. And that's a great way to sort of divvy up the board work too, and establish collaborative relationships. For what it's worth. The other thing, I don't know, this didn't really come up, but I know and I don't know if anyone else did it, but early on in the chair role, and I think Rich maybe in his, Rich Cassidy in his role as chair would meet with union representation like once a month or so. And I know I did that with co-presidents of the union, and it was really just a way to keep abreast of what were the concerns, what was going on. It sort of phased out over time, and I think some of it was related to, I think there was an effort to push a specific agenda, and when that might not happen, I think there was less interest in that. But that was certainly something that was done in the past that could be done in the future too.
So
What sort of-
when you were doing that, what came of those meetings besides just hearing them? Like, was there any actionable space or actions or positions? Like, what was the result of those meetings?
I can't recall anything specific except reporting back. This came up and it's on some, you know, on the union's mind, and it might have made it to an agenda item at some point, but I do think that's a little bit where it phased out, because I think there was an interest in being more influential around policy change, and it was more of a listening venue from my perspective, I know.
And I will say I got severe pushback on that. I did meet with union leadership right before I stepped on the board, literally the day before I came on the board. I had made a point, because they had reached out to me to sort of peel me out as a candidate when I was running. And I thought it was important to sort of, you know, reach out, because as I said, I came on the year after there had been a strike, and being shiny new board member, I thought, you know, what can I do to sort of help the situation? And I sat down with the union president, who is long out of that position now and is retired from the district. And he said, yeah, we won't do that ever again. And it wasn't based on in their minds, it was, we're done. We're not doing these meetings with the school board anymore. And it became a much more adversarial relationship. And we struggled to sort of heal that in some way. We felt like we came to the table with very open minds and things that we thought would be compromises and stuff, but it was a struggle to build that relationship. So I'm not sure I have very good advice on it, because those behind the scenes meetings will not happening.
So I was just gonna ask, because I'm interested, because, so you meet with them, a lot of stuff comes up. I assume a lot of that is operational, right? Were they bringing up a lot of operational stuff? So at that point, are you just saying, look, that's not what we're dealing with here? I guess what I'm trying to differentiate is, from a policy governance perspective, you're meeting with the union, you're meeting with staff, essentially, right? And a lot of their issues are going to be around, hey, you know, we don't think this is working or that's working, but that a lot of that falls under the purview of the superintendent for policy governance.
Yeah,
So what was,
my recollection is whatever might have come up was more operational, and to me, it was really just establishing a relationship and listening. But as I said, it wasn't sustainable.
and did you bring that back to the superintendent at some point, or how did that?
It would be communicated, that I would communicate what came up, but that was sort of,
Yeah, and I certainly had sidebars of that sort, impromptu, where I viewed myself as essentially being a conduit and said as much. And then, yeah, would communicate it back to the board chair, the superintendent, if it seemed important. So informally, yeah, just another avenue, you know.
Say it wasn't sustainable, why wasn't it sustainable?
I think it was kind of a mutual decision. It started out where I was meeting with the co-presidents, and then one wouldn't show up, and it just sort of waned. And, you know, I mean, I'm not gonna surmise what you know, the co-presidents at the time were thinking. But to me, it was having a relationship, and I think I did have that with two individuals who were in that role at the time. But in terms of the issues that came up, it really, it would have come up in negotiations if it was a negotiable contract issue.
That's one of my primary concerns is having conversations that are meant for the negotiations table, outside of negotiations and behind closed doors away from the community. That's one of my primary concerns about the board meeting with co-presidents. And so with that understanding, what in your experience would be potential risks or problems with the board meeting with?
As long as you don't have a quorum and don't claim to be representing the board, I don't see a problem with it. That's just me.
And I guess it would be what would define the purpose and the scope of the conversations.
Yeah, and there's a concern if you're in negotiations, my concern would be that the union is going to try to divide the board. I mean, in fact, it's a high likelihood if it's difficult negotiations that happen, so. I'd be very careful if you're in negotiations on whether to have those kind of meetings.
We're gonna, I don't know, Chelsea, we're gonna just segue a little bit. I wanna use everybody's time here, but I don't know. how
I
you
just have one quick question. I was just wondering if you, when the strike, during the time of the strike, was the board meeting with the unions at that point? Union
I mean, in negotiation, oh, you mean outside?
during the strike,
negotiation?
yeah, like it just, did it align with it? Had you already stopped?
No, those informal meetings had stopped.
Had stopped, okay.
And would you, to go back to the time when you were meeting with the co-presidents regularly, maybe not in your time, but during that time, would you say that it was like a kind of an escape valve for pressure?
In terms of,
Totally just people feelings, emotions, like, you know, frustration. pent up.
well, no, not really. It was, I would say it was effort to influence somewhat, and inform. But the co-presidents were not on the negotiating team, so those became very separate,
Sorry,
you know, at the time. So it was definitely more, my goal was information sharing, and I think, but again, I'm reticent to speak because these folks are long out of the system and it's ancient history at this point, but I would surmise it might have been a little bit more to it.
did you just say that the co-presidents of the union that you would meet with were not part of the negotiating team? for the
Correct.
union? Yeah, I think that's also pretty important.
There was a clear distinction.
Yeah, they kept them much more bifurcated in the
Yeah.
past than they are now.
So we are actually past time. I'd love, do we have a little bit more time just to make sure that if there's a question left that's really important to anyone here or to you to share on?
Yeah, I'd like to just make sure we stay on the schedule to allow time with, for the executive session.
So it's 11:39 right now. But I feel like the things we haven't covered are school board interfacing with the superintendent and staff, evaluation process input. Why did you decide to leave the board, work requirements, effective time management, and effective subcommittees? Are there any of those topics that anyone feels very strongly that we cover before we adjourn this part of the session?
Great conversation.
I do see we have a member of the public with a hand raised. We took that question or comment.
Sure.
Could we unmute Jerry Silverstein, please?
So I could say a lot of things, but I'll just correct, if I will, one comment that Ms. Burkhart said. She said something to the effect of making cuts every year. This is a misrepresentation of reality, Bridget. We know about slide in the recent budget, which showed in FY 24, 25, and 26, there were a total of 45 FTEs, cuts, reductions, and everybody talks about that. But noticeably absent from that discussion is the fact in the year before, in the FY 23 budget, there was an addition of 39.19 FTEs. Again, an addition, not a cut. If you compare the FTE count in FY '21 to the FTE count in FY '26, the difference over that span of time is 0.18 FTEs. That's 0.1 FTEs. So you can talk about cuts in FY '24, '25, and '26, but if you don't talk about the additions in FY '23, then you're deceiving the public. In that interval from FY '21 to FY '26, spending was up 36%, inflation was up 20%, and FTEs were decreased by a count of 0.18 FTEs. So you talked about communication with the public. If you can't communicate accurate information to the public, then you should probably not communicate any information whatsoever.
Gary, this is Seamus Absher. When are you gonna run for the board? I'm looking forward, and that is a sincere question.
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
People often ask me that, and the reason has always been the same. When the board will talk about education, when the board will talk about learning, then I will run for the board. That rarely happens. And evidence of that is the legislature won't talk about the VT cap scores in 224. Local communities won't talk about these scores. Nobody wants to talk about academic learning as determined by standardized tests. At the recent board meeting, you all heard me quote more knowledgeable individuals than myself at prestigious universities across the country who have all said the same thing. Grades and grade point averages no longer document how well a student will do both in college and in their careers. What will determine how successful they are is standardized tests. Yet there is an intention to deny talking about those at every level of government in the state of Vermont. And when somebody starts talking about those poor performance scores, then I will consider running for the board. Otherwise, it's a waste of my time, and it would create enormous dissension within the board if I kept bringing this up. That's why I don't run for the board.
I would welcome you as a colleague. And that's a sincere thing, because I think that the only way democracy works is precisely if people bring issues up in a way that they can make change.
Yeah, perhaps I misunderstood you, Bridget. I thought you meant trusted services and opportunities.
I think we don't need to litigate it right now.
Okay.
Can we unmute Noah, please? Noah, could you please state your full name for the record so we know what you know what we're talking to?
Hi, I'm Noah Everett. I live in Heinsberg. I'm one of the current co-presidents of the SBA, and I just wanted to offer kind of as a memory aid that after the strike in 2014, those meetings did end, but I believe, my memory is that we began them again when I became president to try to reestablish that trust. And a lot of the work at that time was around statewide healthcare, and that's a lot of what we discussed. Thanks.
Comments?
Thank you, my part, just to say thank you.
Thank you for your service.
And I'm pleased to do this, so you wanna do it again, if you wanna get in touch, my information is public. And I'm happy to, well, most of you have it anyway, but yeah.
Folks on the board reach out to you all personally with follow-up questions or,
Oh, yeah.
you know, in a mentoring capacity, should there be mutual
I
interest.
think you all know where we live. so.
Yes. I really appreciate you all being here. I always learn from you all and really appreciate the discussion this morning. Thank you for your time on a Saturday.
Can I ask just one quick question? So the board members that weren't able to be here today, will they be reviewing this meeting online or?
It will be recorded, so they'll have. the
Yes,
option,
reports.
And Director Dan Boyer has been on virtually this time. Yeah, so.
And again, thank you, all of, thank you. So much.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Dan.
Nice.
Good morning.
Okay, so yes, with that, I would take a motion to enter into executive session for the purpose of discussing labor negotiations. And not to do so in open. Not to do so in closed session would put the district at a disadvantage. Do I have a motion?
So move to, what do you, executive?
Who moves to a second?
Second.
Shayna seconds. Any discussion? So just to be crystal clear, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, Martin Lalonde, Brian Lanier, Bridget Burkhardt, the full board, Dan Boyer, who's on virtually, and Superintendent Nichols will be entering into executive session, and then at some point during that executive session, the former board members I've just listed will leave.
Whatever you please.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion passes, and we will adjourn the regular session in the executive session, but we'll come back online to do so. Okay, thank you.